What kills the man who knows more about death underwater than anyone alive? Sheck Exley studied thousands of other people's deaths in flooded caves and drew up the rules that saved thousands of divers. He was the first man in the world to go deeper than 800 feet and come back alive. On the 6th of April, 1994, he descends into the Mexican pit of Zacatón, toward the 1,000-foot mark that no one had ever touched. His computer will freeze at a depth of around 904 feet. Only his partner will surface. What happened to Exley in the black depths, where a man's own body turns against him, no one will ever see. Sheck Exley is born on the 1st of April, 1949, in Florida. On the outside, this state looks flat and settled, yet beneath it hides an entire drowned world. Its thin layer of limestone is riddled with hundreds of underwater caves, springs, and sinkholes. The water in them is clear, cold, and drops away tens of meters into darkness. This geography, hidden from sight, will shape his whole life. He starts diving in 1965 at 16. That same year, he first goes underwater into a cave, and he can no longer stop. In the mid-60s, cave diving barely exists as a discipline. There are no proven rules, no statistics, no understanding of how many people have already died and why. People descend into flooded passages almost blind, trusting to luck and to the air in their tanks. 3 years after his first dives comes a blow that Exley will carry for the rest of his life. On the 29th of June, 1968, home from college for the holidays, he free dives without scuba gear in the Wakula Spring together with his younger brother Edward. Sheck has a new depth gauge, and the brothers set up a risky contest. Who can go deeper? One after the other, they drop lower and lower, meter by meter. 15-year-old Edward goes deeper than his brother, starts to ascend, and suddenly blacks out. Sheck tries several times to reach him on a single breath, but he can't. While he panics his way back to shore for a scuba rig, another diver manages to bring the boy up from the bottom. Sheck revives Edward, an ambulance takes him away, but he never regains consciousness and dies that same night. This loss does not drive Sheck away from the water. It turns his whole relationship with it upside down. Where others chase a thrill, Exley begins to look for safety. His main tool becomes not fearlessness, but cold calculation. A passion has to be paid for somehow, so he picks a quiet, down-to-earth profession. Exley takes a job as a math teacher at Suwannee High School in the town of Live Oak. So begins his double life. On weekdays, he stands at the board, chalk in hand, explaining formulas and equations to teenagers. On weekends, he descends into narrow, flooded passages, where that same math becomes a matter of life and death. Gas, depth, time, decompression. His students see a calm, polite teacher. Few of them suspect where he goes the moment the last bell rings on Friday, to a place from which not everyone comes back. While his peers chased new sensations, Exley turned risk into a subject of study. Already at 23, he becomes the first person in the world to make over 1,000 cave dives. Over 29 years underwater, the total will pass 4,000. But it isn't the number of dives that sets him apart. What sets him apart is what he does between them. Exley doesn't just dive. He studies other people's deaths. He collects reports of fatalities in flooded caves from all over the country and lays them out like problems on a blackboard. Who died, where, at what depth, what they did wrong. Gradually, behind the separate tragedies, a pattern emerges. People die not from cruel fate, but from repeating mistakes. They lost the guideline. They went too deep. They miscalculated their gas supply. They went alone, without the skill they needed. Out of this cold-blooded analysis, a body of rules is born. In 1979, his book comes out, Basic Cave Diving, A Blueprint for Survival. The title says it all, not how to enjoy yourself, but how to stay alive. These rules will become the foundation of training all over the world, the bedrock on which divers are still taught today. Exley's authority grows along with the discipline. On the 6th of February 1974, he becomes the first person in its history to head the cave diving section of the American Speleological Society. He standardizes the octopus, a backup regulator, a second mouthpiece. You can switch to it if the main one fails, or hand it to a partner who has run out of gas. A simple device that becomes a mandatory part of the kit. So a math teacher from a small town gradually turns into the man whose rules define the shape of the entire discipline. He builds a system, meant to keep new names from ever landing in his own tables of the dead. To understand what Exley worked against his whole life, you have to descend to the place where he spent his weekends. A dry cave forgives a lot. Get lost, sit down, catch your breath, wait for help, retrace your steps. A flooded cave forgives almost nothing. There is no air here to breathe, and often no direct route to the surface. Overhead, there is no open sky, but a vault of stone with hundreds of meters of rock beyond it. There is only one point of reference, the guideline, a thin cord strung from the entrance into the depths. The diver moves along it, holding it by hand or by eye, and returns the same way. Brush the silt on the bottom with a fin or a hand, and the water turns to impenetrable milk, where you cannot even see your own fingers. To lose the guideline in that murk is to lose the way out. This is the scenario Exley found again and again in the reports of the dead. The second enemy is the gas itself. The supply is finite, and depth devours it fast. The deeper you go, the denser the air, the more of it each breath consumes. And there is a treachery in physics. At great depth, ordinary air begins to act like a drug. Nitrogen narcosis clouds the mind, and oxygen under high pressure turns into a poison that can trigger convulsions. The brain, which is supposed to make precise decisions, is itself poisoned by its surroundings. And finally, the return. You cannot simply surface. The gas dissolved under pressure has to leave the body slowly, or bubbles will boil up in the blood. So, for minutes spent at depth, you pay with hours of slow ascent, broken by stops. Exley understood this better than most. He did not think of the cave as evil or vengeful. It is simply indifferent and grants no right to a second try. His whole system of rules was an attempt to bargain with that indifference through calculation, and the calculation he intended to push to its limit. In the 70s and 80s, Exley's very goal changes. Before, he had been drawn by distance, how far one could push into a horizontal labyrinth, working kilometers from the entrance. Now he is pulled more and more downward into the vertical. Not how far, but how deep. And that is a completely different task, far more merciless. The trouble is that ordinary air won't let you go deep. Those same narcosis and oxygen toxicity we spoke of rise up like a solid wall already at a few hundred feet, long before the bottom of the pits that interest Exley. A diver breathing compressed air there risks losing consciousness or facing convulsions, all of it in total darkness, far from the exit. To go deeper, the air has to be replaced with something else. The answer is trimix, a breathing blend of three gases, helium, oxygen, and nitrogen. Helium replaces part of the nitrogen and sharply cuts the narcotic effect. It lets you keep a clear head where air would long since have driven a man out of his mind. Exley is one of the first to seriously use trimix in caves and to prove its worth in practice. The proving ground for these experiments becomes the Mexican spring of Nacimiento del Monte, a deep funnel of warm water dropping steeply down. Time after time, Exley pushes the depth wrecker further and further down. But every new meter is not bravery. It's arithmetic. Exley draws up the decompression tables himself, by hand, sitting for hours over paper and a calculator. How long to spend on the bottom, at what depth to make a stop, and how long to hang there so the gas leaves the body safely, which mix to breathe at each stage. That same math he taught schoolchildren in Live Oak here becomes the line between coming back and dying. A mistake in a column of figures costs not a bad grade, but a life. March of 1989 becomes the peak of these calculations. At the Mante Spring, Exley goes down to 881 feet, about 267 meters. For a diver descending without a diving bell and without surface-supplied gas, this is a world depth record. Only commercial divers had gone deeper. But they were supplied with breathing gas from the surface through a hose and given days for a slow return inside a chamber. Exley has only his tanks on his back, his mixes, and his tables. The descent itself takes only minutes. His body drops like a stone down the wall of the pit, the pressure rising with every meter. But the return stretches over 14 hours. For 14 hours, Exley hangs in the water at different depths, moving from stop to stop, and switching mixes on a schedule he worked out in advance. He cannot surface a single minute faster. That reckoning in bubbles waits right near the surface for anyone who rushes. Exley comes out of this dive with no harm to his health, and that perhaps matters more than the record itself. He proves that extreme depth can be conquered not by luck alone, but by a system. The right mix, a precise schedule, iron discipline on the ascent. Beside him on these expeditions dives Mary Ellen Eckhoff, a person close to him and a strong diver. She sets her own women's depth record. Manti shows the whole world that the limit of the possible lies far further than people had believed. Where others once saw certain death, Exley passes through and returns. But every such victory has a flip side. The deeper a person goes, the closer he comes to limits that no calculation and no experience can get around. Limits built into the very physiology of the body under monstrous pressure. Against one of these limits, he will one day strike. It happens in August of 1993, and not in Florida, not in Mexico, but at the other end of the world. Exley travels to South Africa, to the flooded cave of Boesman's Gat, the Bushman's Hole, a huge underground chamber filled with water, deep and cold. Once again he goes after a record, and once again he descends down the wall of the pit, toward a bottom no one has ever touched. At 863 feet, he reaches the bottom. Formally, this is a success, another conquered depth. But this time, his body fails him in a way no calculation could foresee. At depth, Exley is overtaken by high-pressure nervous syndrome, known by the abbreviation HPNS. This is not gas poisoning, nor a mistake in the mix. It is the human nervous system's direct reaction to enormous pressure when a diver descends quickly to extreme depth. The symptoms are severe. Vision blurs. The picture before the eyes shakes and doubles. An uncontrollable tremor runs through the body, one that no effort of will can still. Thoughts scatter. Against this state, any experience is powerless. However many thousands of dives are behind you, the body reacts to pressure the same way. That is what makes HPNS so terrifying. It strikes not the unskilled, but everyone alike once you go deep enough. Exley survives. As he ascends, the pressure drops and the symptoms recede. The tremor eases, his vision clears. He returns to the surface alive and, once again, with a record. But something in this dive changes forever. For the first time in many years, the cave shows him a limit that cannot be gotten around by skill, by math, or by a perfect mix. There is a depth at which the nervous system itself slips out of control, and no preparation can help. Now Exley knows about that boundary better than anyone. And yet ahead of him lies a goal that sits deeper still. It waits for him in the Mexican state of Tamaulipas, and it is called Zacatón. On the surface, it is a cenote, a round sinkhole filled with warm water, its surface often covered by floating islands of vegetation. But beneath that peaceful skin hides one of the deepest flooded pits on the planet. Its depth is estimated at around 1,080 feet, over 300 meters of a nearly sheer shaft plunging into darkness. From the surface, the bottom cannot be seen at all. The water simply blackens downward, and there, in that blackness, lies the mark Exley had prepared for all his life. The point is 1,000 feet, a round, symbolic figure that no diver descending without a diving bell had yet crossed. 1,000 feet is no longer a record for the sake of a record. It is the very border of what possible means for a human being underwater. This is what Exley and his longtime companion Jim Bowden mean to take. Exley knows Zacaton firsthand. A year earlier, in 1993, he had already dived here and reached 721 feet. The pit did not give up its full depth then, but it showed that the bottom was still far below. 2 days before the main attempt, Exley makes another dive and sets a depth record on ordinary air, around 420 feet. It is as if he is testing both himself and the place before the decisive descent. By April of 1994, a serious expedition gathers at Zacatón. This is no longer a quiet dive by two friends in the wilds. There is the press, photographers, a television crew from Tampico, representatives of sporting publications. Everyone understands that history could unfold before their eyes, a record the whole world of technical diving will talk about. None of those gathered wants to think that this story could have a different ending, and the warm, dark water of Zacatón stays silent and gives away nothing of what it hides at the bottom. The two experienced divers plan the dive down to the smallest detail. Exley and Bowden decide to go down at the same time, but along separate guidelines. Each has his own cord strung along the wall of the pit. The reason is simple and sober. On a fast descent in darkness, when both are dropping almost in free fall, it is far too easy to collide on a single line, and any snag here is costly. Even more important is something else they accept in advance. At the depth they are going to, helping each other is impossible. If something happens to one, the other cannot lift him, share his gas, or turn him around. Each goes for himself, and this is not bravado, but the cold truth of extreme depth diving. The separate lines only cement this inevitable solitude. Their breathing mixes are slightly different. Exley breathes a blend the team calls Heli-Air 6, Bowden, Heli-Air 6 and 4. Both mixes are calculated to reduce narcosis and the risk of oxygen poisoning at maximum depth, but no one knows the exact depth of the bottom, nor how much time will have to be spent down there. So, the divers take along several sets of decompression tables at once for different outcomes. The plan itself is brutal in its arithmetic. At the bottom, each will have only a few minutes, a brief touch of record depth, the very thing it was all for. And after that, a multi-hour ascent with dozens of stops, during which the support team must deliver the right tanks at the right depths. The helpers stage the decompression tanks in advance, hanging them along the lines like the rungs of a long ladder up. Both divers understand how thin this plan is, and both trust their own calculations and their decades of experience. In the morning, they will enter the water, trusting the numbers they worked out themselves. The weather that day is not conducive to calm. From early morning, it is uneasy over Tamaulipas, gusting wind, an approaching storm, a gray, oppressive sky. Later, Bowden will remember precisely that anxious, stormy atmosphere of that morning. But the expedition is ready, the gear is hung along the lines, the team is in place. No one intends to back out. At around 9:50 in the morning, both divers go under. Before descending into the shaft, they have to pass a narrow passage with a grim name, El Pasaje de la Tortuga Muerte, the passage of the dead turtle. Beyond it, Exley and Bowden find themselves over the black mouth of the pit and begin their plunge downward, each along his own guideline. For the first minutes, everything goes to plan. About a quarter of an hour in, they pass a ledge at a depth of around 250 feet. For them, this is still relatively shallow, only the start of the real descent. From here, the wall drops almost sheer into darkness, and both keep sinking, separated by water and gloom, unable to see each other. From above, they watch the bubbles. The exhale gas rises to the surface in silvery chains, and by them, one can roughly judge that the divers are breathing, that they are alive. But at some moment, the team notices something terrible. Only one trail of bubbles is rising from below. One trail instead of two. It is Bowden's trail. The second stream is gone. Exley at this time keeps going down his line, alone, in total darkness, cut off from everyone. His wrist computer coldly writes out the depth figures: 500 feet, 600, 700, 800. Somewhere around 904 feet, the device records its last value. After that, there is no more. What happens to the man in these minutes at the bottom of the black pit, no one sees. The water of Zacatón keeps it to itself and gives up to the surface only a lonely chain of another man's bubbles. For Jim Bowden in those same minutes, a struggle of his own, no less dangerous, is underway. He descends to around 925 feet, a fantastic depth, falling just short of the coveted 1,000-foot mark. But his gas supply is draining faster than planned, and he makes the only correct decision, to turn around and begin the ascent without reaching the goal. Ahead of him lies a multi-hour decompression, during which any mistake can still cost him his life. At one of the stops, at around the 47th minute, a member of the team, Anne Christovich, comes to him. She descends to meet him, to support Bowden on the long way up, and sees what everyone had feared. Exley's decompression tanks, hung on his line, remain untouched. No one has used them. The gas in them is intact, the regulators unused. The meaning of this picture is terrible in its simplicity. If Exley were ascending on schedule, he would already have passed these depths, switched to these tanks, breathed from them. The untouched gear means that he never began his ascent at all. He did not reach the first stops. Judging by the data from his computer, something happened very early, at around the 9th minute of the dive, still on the way down, or at the lowest point. Bowden does not yet know this in every detail, but he senses disaster. Only one thing is left to him: to survive himself. He spends more than 9 hours underwater in all, and rises slowly from stop to stop, breathing on schedule while the team hands him tanks. When he finally surfaces, the stormy day is already leaning toward evening. He comes back alive, but alone. Above, they meet him not as a record holder, but as the only one who returned from the water that swallowed his comrade. The second diver remains below. When it becomes finally clear that Exley will not surface, the expedition faces a brutal reality. No one can go down after him. Not a single person in the world can go to 900 feet to bring another back. The very depth that took Exley now guards his body reliably against any attempt at rescue. A rescue operation in the usual sense simply does not exist. It is physically impossible. All that is left is to wait. Only 3 days later, as the team gradually hauls up the remaining gear and lines, do they finally find him. Exley's body, in that time, had risen from the depths on its own and become entangled in the guideline. It did not stay at the very bottom. It floated up and caught on the cord somewhere along the way. The details of this discovery say a great deal. In one of the tanks there was still gas left. Exley never used up his whole supply. On the display of his computer, that final depth figure, taken at the 9th minute, had frozen in place. But the most striking detail is another. The guideline turns out to be wrapped around the valves of his tanks. This winding does not look accidental. It is done too neatly, too deliberately, to write it off as the play of a current or as chance. Many of those who knew Exley and studied what happened come to a single conclusion: he did it himself, consciously. A man who spent his whole life studying other people's deaths and thinking about the safety of others may, to the very end, have been thinking of those who would remain above. One way or another, he stays tied to his line, to the very thread that had been for him a symbol of order and return. Only this time, it led not to the exit, but became the final point of his path. The exact cause of death could not be established, and most likely never will be. Underwater at such a depth, there were no witnesses. All that remained to the experts were the figures on the instruments, the state of the gear, and an understanding of the physiology of extreme depths. On this basis, the team and the specialists build their theories, but none can be conclusively proven. The leading theory points to that same HPNS that overtook Exley a year earlier at Boesman's Gat. At 900 feet, the pressure is even greater than it was in South Africa, which means the syndrome could have struck harder. At Boesman's Gat, Exley pulled off the ascent and the symptoms receded. Here, the turnaround and the switching of mixes had to be done far deeper and far earlier. And precision of movement is exactly what the syndrome takes first. If his body failed again at the crucial moment, there was nothing left to save him with. The specialists consider other mechanisms too, often in combination. Oxygen under such pressure can cause a sudden bout of convulsions. Nitrogen, even diluted with helium, adds a narcotic haze and slows thinking. It may be that several factors worked at once, overlaid on one another in a place where a human being has not the slightest margin of safety. Standing apart is the theory of what the guideline wrapped around his tanks means. Some see it as a desperate attempt to secure himself and not sink deeper. Others, as the sober choice of a man who understood he would not return. In either case, behind the gesture stands not panic, but the work of a mind to the last second. What truly happened, the water of Zacatón will not tell. Sheck Exley leaves this life just 5 days after turning 45. He dies at a depth no diver descending without a diving bell had ever touched before him, at the very border of what a human being can physically endure underwater. In a sense, he reaches the edge and remains upon it. His main legacy, though, stayed on land. His books, Blueprint for Survival, and others, have served for decades as the foundation of training in safe cave diving. The rules he drew from the cold analysis of other people's tragedies continue to save divers even today. Many of them will never learn to whom they owe their lives. Trimix, which became the standard for deep dives, the octopus, as a mandatory backup regulator, the very idea that every death must be analyzed so that it does not happen again. All of this entered the discipline and remained in it after him. The memory of him took hold in the language of the community as well. An award bears his name, given for 1,000 safe cave dives after full training. It is fitting that a man obsessed with safety became the very measure of it. A new species of tiny cave crustacean, discovered by scientists, was named in his honor, so the diver's name remained both in the sport and in science. And in this lies the bitter symmetry of his fate. The man who spent his whole life reducing other people's deaths to tables so that people would come back alive became himself the last line in such a table. He devoted himself to pushing the border of the possible forward safely, and he died pushing it further than anyone. Zacatón never fully gave up its secret. It only showed where that line runs. And the name of Sheck Exley remains standing right on it, there where calculation ends and what yields to neither tables nor will begins.